Hi guys, this is Ben Bolton, and in this episode we're going to be making the low poly model of the G56. Like the other episodes, this was about 3 hours in real time. It's sped up 400%, so we're going to see it in about 45 minutes. Most of this episode, and most of low poly making in general, is just going to be me welding and target welding and collapsing and booleaning a lot of stuff together. It's just kind of the nature of it. So it might not be as interesting as the previous episodes, but I'll try to keep a running commentary on it. Um, so I'm just starting with the magazine just because it's a little self-contained unit. So I'll usually pick something like this just to start with and get a flow going. Um, you can see here I booleaned the main body of the magazine together with the floor plate, and I'm just stitching it up. The reason that we want to combine separate elements like that, and I end up doing a lot of that in this video, and as part of my general workflow, is pretty much because the more things we can combine into one object, the less UV waste we'll have in the end, just because you won't have as many pieces of mesh that are inside one another. It also makes for an easier bake because you have fewer objects to push cages out of. You don't have you don't have as much intersecting geometry that you have to worry about exploding and then making secondary AO bakes, so that you can get nice contact shadows with everything that you exploded apart. Still a good idea to do that, but you don't have to do as much of the exploding part. You don't have to move as many things away from each other just because you have fewer separate objects. So what I'll usually try to do is I'll keep separate anything that has to move, um, because obviously if it's in the same geometry as static stuff, then it won't be able to. I'll keep separate anything that would be something we'd want to keep modular on the gun, something that design might end up wanting to take off, and that would be like, for example, in this gun, I'm still not sure. I might make some of the variants for it that the concept artist has drawn, and those entail like different barrels and different stocks. So those two things, for example, I won't fuse into the main body of the gun, even though they could be because they're both static pieces that don't have to animate. We're going to keep them separate so that they can be swapped out later with variant stocks, variant barrels. Something like this vertical foregrip, we would definitely keep separate also, just because design might decide they don't want it, and plus it's not so much an integral part of the gun. We could just model it like right into the rail, of course, and make for one less exploded thing in the bake, but it's just an obvious target for something that might want to be taken out or switched with different things. Like maybe this is a kind of game where the user can put a grenade launcher on that bottom rail or whatever, an angled foregrip or something, or maybe just have no foregrip at all. Then that's something we can easily do if we don't model it in as one piece. But for other stuff like the upper receiver and the bottom receiver, that magwell area, and the heat shield at the front, and the top rails and the side rails and bottom rails, we're going to connect all that stuff into one large chunk. And then we don't have to separate any of that when we're baking. We don't have to waste any UV space in the areas between those. We can do large parts of the gun as just big, large UV shells that are really easy to work with when it comes to texturing, because you don't have to spend as much time hunting down the specific thing that you want to texture on. We can make it as intuitive as possible to just glance at the texture sheet and kind of know where everything is. And that really speeds things up in that stage. Sometimes it can also result in a bit of a lower triangle count, I find, too. So here we're just continuing, we're moving around. This is the connecting geometry between the barrel and the gas tube. I'm just collapsing some of these edges. This is something that's further from the player's eye, um, so it doesn't necessarily need as many sides. Sometimes these things come into like silhouette from first person, so you have to be checking from first person a lot because even though this is far away, if we can see it from first person angle in the silhouette of the gun, sometimes we still have to leave more edges in it just to make sure it appears round because the human eye is really good at picking up silhouettes. So especially with something like this gun, if you were holding it against a very light surface, like if you were in a daytime level in a game and you held it up to the sky, or you held it up to like a halogen lamp or something, then you'd be able to spot any polygonal stuff in the silhouette, any obviously jagged things that are meant to be round, and that's something we really want to avoid when we're working on this low poly because things like that, like major silhouette jaggedness, that's a big communicator to the it's a good signal to the user that something's low poly, and that's what we're trying to avoid. We're trying to make the end result look as high poly as possible, like ideally just indistinguishable from the high poly. But at the same time, we have to work within the specific budget, so we have to minimize where we can. And so that's on areas like this. It turns out that the heat shield mostly blocks this, and I determined that by actually looking at the gun from first person while working on this. The heat shield mostly blocks your view of this from first person, so I didn't add as many edges as you might have to if this was a clearly silhouetted part. So I think I used Pro Boolean in this, and then I realized I didn't really have to. I could have just connected it manually just as easily. The reason you don't always want to use Pro Boolean is because if you have a different number of edges in cylindrical parts, right, like I do here, you end up having to bridge stuff up by hand or else target welding edges that kind of ran into other edges in an inconvenient way. I actually discovered something about Pro Boolean while making this video, so I actually use it a little better after a certain point in this video. I don't totally remember where it was, but Pro Boolean has an option in it. It's like you can pick one of three type thing. One of them is no edge removal. One is remove something or other. I can't remember. You don't want to use it. And then one is remove invisible only. And until now, I've just been setting it to no edge removal. But I think if you set it to remove invisible only, it'll actually clear up a lot of those little junk verts that I talked about in previous episodes. So I feel kind of silly. I didn't realize that until the actual making of this episode. But it's good to know. So in future, I can put that in practice. It's a good thing to keep in mind if you end up deciding to try Pro Boolean out for yourself if you haven't used it a lot, or if you have been using it and like me you didn't know about that particular option, then maybe you should give it a shot. So here on the rails, I'm busting the teeth out of them, or just one tooth on each rail set because all the teeth are a little different. The reason we're doing that is so we can just float those actual teeth, because we don't want to have to make all the connecting geometry on the low poly to support them. It kind of violates that one chunk rule I was talking about before, where you try to keep as much stuff as one chunk as possible. But in this case, it's okay because we only got to float the one tooth, right, when we do this bake. And then later on we can just instance it down the entire rail length, and that's not really that hard. Gives us some flexibility, so like, for example, if we decide our rails are too fat or too thin or too tall or too wide, we can still change them to some degree because they're not built into the actual mesh. And it also means we can make things like that different on the first person or third person model if we want. So if we decide that in first person the rails need to be a bit longer or wider or chunkier in order to not alias to read well from first person, but we find that looks really weird on the NPC model, we can easily change that by just reversing it on the NPC model, making the teeth, thinner, closer to how they would be in reality. And because they're floating, it doesn't matter. Like, they can both use the same texture. It won't be difficult. Working on the stock back here, just cleaning up some of the messy blockout geometry. I think I was fairly happy with this blockout. how it ended up working. Most of the low poly was spent as it should be, in my opinion, just cleaning up the blockout geometry and welding things together and attaching stuff. Not so much building new geometry, as like forming an envelope by hand around a high poly mesh or removing a lot of support loops or whatever. I think the time division on this ended up being pretty equal. I think it was about 3 hours for the blockout. It was just slightly longer for the high poly and about the same for the low poly, so that's like 9 hours for all the model components, which feels pretty good. By the end of this video, of course, we're not 100% done because I still have to UV map it. That'll be the next video. And there's still a few more tweaks I want to make to the low poly. Like I think there's probably a couple things I missed when recording. It's usually like that just because when recording you're really time conscious and you don't want to have a lot of dead air where you're looking over the whole model and just looking for anything you might have missed. So sometimes I'll miss a few little things. That happened in the high poly or the blockout video when we saw in the beginning of the high poly one. I just went back and I added a couple things. We're probably going to do that next episode. There's still a couple high poly things I want to add. Just things like notches in the rear sight and stuff. Just really minor details. A few bolts in a couple places on the receiver. Just really tiny ones that didn't get to in the main video. And there's going to be a few changes to the low poly to make, so we'll probably do those at the very beginning of the UV video. Here, these were, of course, 3 different pieces originally. There was the main stock, and then that connecting bit, and then the butt of it. We just connected them all together here. Because, of course, none of that has to articulate. Here on the this little fling loop buffer back of the receiver thing, we're just simplifying the geometry up. Later on, we're going to build this into the actual receiver. But for now, I'm just cleaning the geometry because that connection will be easier to make if we start without all the extra geo that was in the blockout that we don't necessarily need. I keep symmetry on with these rear sights while working with them, and that's something I'll do a lot. Well, you want to do it a lot at any time of modeling, but I do it a lot with low poly especially because it's pretty tedious to do all this cleanup work, and if the object is symmetrical anyway, it's better to only have to do it once. So there's some stuff like cylinders where you can get away with using 2 symmetry modifiers, so you only have to work on a quarter of the cylinder, and then you do like a symmetry across X and one across Z, for example. And that's really helpful. It helps speed this up a lot. Pretty much in low poly, you gain the most speed improvements just through little things like that. Not through really like big techniques, in my opinion, but just anything that can even incrementally speed up your workflow, because you just have to work over pretty much every asset in the gun and just strip detail out of it and connect it with other things. One other advantage to this technique of having such a detailed blockout is that we don't have to be constantly checking our low poly as we build it against the high poly to make sure that it matches all the dimensions and stuff, make sure that all the details are in there, just because that stuff was set in stone during the blockout. I think that's how it should be, just because it minimizes the amount of dependency that these meshes have on each other, or like the amount of checking you have to do back and forth. Because since both the low poly and high poly are based pretty much directly off the blockout, then the only thing we have to worry about is making changes to the blockout to get these meshes. We don't have to constantly be comparing them to each other, and that's helpful. Here we can see I am not using symmetry as much as I should be on this cylinder bit, kind of breaking my own advice. I do that a little early on in this video. I was recording parts of this after work. This was over a couple different sessions, and sometimes you're not firing on all cylinders, but I think in the latter parts of this video, in the last recording session or 2 that I did for this, my mind is more with me, so definitely be using more symmetry on that. I apologize if I know it's probably kind of boring to watch me just take a cylinder and strip edges out of it one by one across the whole thing. But that's pretty much most of what making the low poly is, right? So I didn't want to just totally skip this episode and be like, oh, it's just a lot of welding. Because I know there's probably some people that want to see it, but it really isn't that complicated. There's no kind of secret sauce to this process like there might be for high poly modeling or making blockouts or whatever. This is pretty much a pure workman phase. There's not much artistry to this. Or design work or whatever you want to call it. So this is an example of something that this front sight post you are going to see in silhouette pretty strongly because it sticks off the top of the gun, and of course when you're looking down the sights, your attention is fully on it. So even though it's further away from the character's eye, we're still going to leave a lot of edges on this main, the hooded part of it, just to keep it very round. Also just going to connect this front sight post directly in just so we can bake it as one piece. And so we don't have to waste a single texel on the UV map on the part of that curve that would be under the front sight hood and would just be blacked out with AO anyways. Sometimes, I think sometimes maybe that increases the triangle count. Sometimes it reduces it, I find, connecting stuff together. But usually, whatever changes it makes aren't significant enough one way or another, in my mind, to outweigh the benefits you get in terms of ease of baking information. So, yeah, it's just a really good idea, in my opinion. The negatives don't really add up to much of anything. Later on, we're going to take this rear sight post, rear sight mounting or housing, whatever, and we're attaching both of these sight housings actually into this rail and form one unit out of it. And then later on, we're just going to attach that unit into the upper receiver. This is usually how it works. Like I won't Boolean, everything together all at once. I'll try to like attach two pieces together just at once. So I'm only working on like that one connection at once, and then I'll connect that bit to another bit. And over time, it just snowballs into like one gigantic mesh. And that's good because I think it's good to focus like that for a few reasons. One is just so that you can concentrate your effort in one area at a time and not have to worry about making all these connections all over the model, which can be a little, I don't know what the word is exactly, it can be a little overbearing or make you realize how large your task is going to be by putting it all in front of you at once. So it can make it a little harder to build a flow up. If you're just working on one task at once that you can see the end of and that you know exactly what you're going to do to accomplish it, and then you basically just treat the entire process as just a series of those steps, and you don't look too far beyond the one you're doing, except to think about how what you're doing might affect those future steps. I think that's a pretty good way to work and to work longer periods of time without getting fatigued. So here we're doing that with this, whatever it's called, lower receiver magwell area. We're fusing that into the rest of the lower receiver or frame, even though it's two pieces. This is something where one of the, we could have left this separate, arguably, because one of the variants the concept artist has drawn has actually like a different magwell area down here. I think it has like a different bolt arrangement, and it might, the top of the magwell might be like higher or lower or something. I can't totally remember right now. So arguably we could have left this piece separate, but I think what I'm going to do is, if I end up doing the variants for this, I'll probably just not do that specific feature of that one. It's the DMR version, I think. It's different because I think it accepts like a higher, or shorter, I should say, magazine, so that you can go prone with the weapon and the magazine won't be like an extended portion out the bottom of it, it'll be flush. But if we want to accomplish that same thing, we can always just do like a shorter magazine and not change the magwell. Now we're connecting more bits. We're connecting the pistol grip here. This was something where we had already, I think we had connected it in the blockout or something, right? Like the trigger guard and the base plate of the pistol grip had connected in, but the top of the pistol grip here didn't. They were separate. So we're just fusing them together now. Not too complicated. Keeping that inside of the chamber area very geometrically simple. It already was, but just keeping it that way. So just removing redundant edges, not really worrying about any complex geometry because there isn't any going on in there. Which maps well to how often it'll be seen, which is very little, possibly never. So in attaching this lower receiver to this upper receiver, I could tell this was going to be a tiny bit finicky, so I didn't boolean these because I didn't want to accidentally create some junk faces or somewhere floating where I might not necessarily spot them. Because the way these things overlap, especially in this front area, is a little weird because their edges don't line up one for one. Like we can see here, the top receiver kind of overhangs a little bit. So I just want to do this manually, and that's pretty easy. Basically, you select you figure out whatever dimension it is that you need a new edge on to connect to, whether it's like on the x-axis or the y. You put an edge down there. You grab the value that you need to move it to, and then you turn on constrain to edge, and you just move the new edge to that value, and then you connect things up. Which, if it's tough to understand that concept verbally, I just did it to connect this side bit that we're looking at here with the angled part up there. And then the very front of that thing, that'll connect into the heat shield eventually. I think that's one of the later things we do. And just like with the high poly, that's something I didn't want to work on right away just because it's like the most complex part of the gun. And I didn't feel like doing it. I didn't feel energetic enough to tackle it right away, so I just let it sit on the back burner kind of near the end. And I just connected some of the simpler stuff first. It was actually connecting this receiver with this sling loop area. This was actually slightly complex because when I was modeling this, I didn't think to make their profile. Basically, they just didn't. So I have to do some reconstruction here. And this is definitely something I could have planned for better if I had thought during the blockout phase, if I had been thinking about connecting these pieces, which I should have been, because they're a pretty obvious target for it. Like I could have made their profiles match, and then we wouldn't have to do all this re-architecture. We could have just deleted the insides and then just welded the outside ones. That's a learning thing. I'm finding making these videos pretty helpful to me too. I've been getting a pretty good response for them, so I know they're helpful to other people, and that's excellent. They've been pretty helpful for me too, because I get to actually watch my workflow over again, just because I'm recording all these audio tracks separately, right? So it's helpful. I get to see little things I could improve on, so that's cool. I haven't done it before.
It's kind of like how if you play a game like a strategy game or something, or if you play a sport even, just watching your games over, because it lets you analyze things outside of the heat of the moment dispassionately. It can be pretty helpful. You spot things that you don't necessarily think about actively while you're working. So here we're doing the double symmetry thing on this cylinder that I was talking about earlier. This must be one of the faster work sessions. So we just have to work on that tiny slice of it, and that makes it much quicker. Ultimately, we're going to be deleting some of these faces in here that just fall inside other meshes. I'm not going to attach this part to, I'm not going to attach this little knob to
the actual housing unit or anything. I could, I'm just not gonna bother. Just it being like a purely cylindrical shape, and the fact that it goes through that concave part of the housing, just might make it kind of a pain later when we're making the cage. Just the potential it could like clip through uh, the mesh in a weird way. It's just too finicky apart, I think, to bother making the same piece. So we'll just float it later on. I mean, explode it later on, and yes, float it also on the low poly. Keep it a separate element. I'm gonna do the double symmetry on this rear sight housing, or not housing, rear sight body. This is one of the things that the player is going to see really well and up close. So we're gonna leave it pretty dense. We're gonna pull away some edges where we can, and you'll see like on this curve, on that curve at the bottom, I leave it more dense at the bottom of the curve and less dense as it approaches being perpendicular to the player's eye, because it's tougher to gauge curves the closer they are to being perpendicular to how you're looking. So at the bottom there, for example, you'll really see the silhouette of the curve, so I just left that part of the curve denser and it'll look rounder. And that trick wouldn't work if you could just like freely move the gun around and see that curve from all angles, but we can be pretty sure of where this particular part will be seen from, because you see it mainly from that first person angle, which doesn't move for a lot of gameplay. And if you do move the gun a lot, like on a reload or something, the rear sight housing that's attached to the rail bit now has little lip things on the side of it, which will just block your view if the gun ends up getting waved around a lot. It'll block your view of the lower part of this, so we don't have to worry about that either. So it's good to think about the context these things will be used in, of course. Generally, where curves or where curved forms like cylinder caps or the very similar, sides of that front sight, where those get thinner and they kind of extrude into thinner areas, it's usually a good idea to start collapsing them, even if they're going to be close to the player's eye. Just because if a circle is like noticeably rounder as it comes inward to form other cylindrical elements in the model, if it gets noticeably thinner, then that's something else that can cue you into it being low poly. Like it just looks weird, and it's not super necessary with some of these really small forms either. So here, like in the bottom of this actual site, we are gonna collapse these edges as they come in towards that middle aperture. And we're gonna leave the ones on the outside of it uncollapsed, like that. And this bottom aperture, I figure, is one you would never use in a given shooter, because well, you might use it in real life because it's a smaller aperture, so you would flip it up if you wanted to take a longer range shot. That's not usually functionality you see in games, and if we were making this for a game that had that functionality, we would definitely be made aware of it before we had to make the actual gun. And that would be a pretty rare request. So for the sake of making this video, I'm just going to keep it as close to like a normal first-person shooter gun as I can. So this would not be a part that ever actually rotates or moves. It's good to show like the functionality of that and build the model in a way that suggests you could flip that around if you wanted to, but practically it's never going to happen in gameplay. Some more work on another knob. At first I was thinking this has some knurling across it, which is like little really small tabs that stick out of it, just so you can get a better grip. Like they're just little friction ridges. And the word for them, I think, is knurling. And I was thinking about maybe keeping them in the first-person model, And that's something you can do because we generally have a much higher triangle count nowadays that we can use for these things than we used to. And where the whole site area is something you see so up close and you pay so much attention to, it can actually be worthwhile to leave even very small details like that in it because your brain will really pick up on it. It's kind of nice to see as a player. But I ended up not keeping them in this case just because I looked at it both with and without them, and really the silhouette was not all that different, and the ridges didn't stick out enough that like parallax would become much of a factor. Like when the gun is moving around, you would notice that parts that are extruded start occluding other parts that are more inset. These just weren't sticking out enough that I think that would be a big factor, so I'm just gonna bake those down. And finally, moving on to this heat shield area. This took a bit of time making the high poly forks. We had to make all the supporting edges around all of these cylindrical extrusions. It's not going to take so long to make the low poly version of it just because we don't have to worry about those supporting edges. But we are still going to have to link all these up. This is something where if you wanted to, you probably could leave these holes out on the first person model. And basically what you would do if you want to just keep these flat is you would just stick some mesh in there on the inside of the hole for the high poly. And when you baked the ambient occlusion or when you baked your material masks or both, you would just make that bit black or some material that later in Photoshop you would select and then make a mask for a black layer with. And so you would just use it to like black off. So when you're looking at this thing in game, where those holes are, you'll just see black and it'll kind of read as a hole. And that's something that has obviously been done for a long time, especially when budgets weren't as high, just because holes like that can be really triangle intensive. Um, so it can be easier. Like in Call of Duty 4, came out years ago. There's Modern Warfare 1. In that, if you look at like the M4, this was something I noticed when it came out. Is a lot of their stuff actually like rails are not even modeled separately a lot of the time. They're not like instanced or floated or anything. They're actually just baked to a single plane. Stuff like holes in heat shields, they'll be blacked out. So it's kind of a good one to look at. Like I don't think those guns are very high spec at the time. Um, Obviously, most first-person shooters now can afford to put a little more detail in, which is cool. So it's nice for a few reasons because if the gun is waving around, you can see stuff like you can see the barrels inside of it, and it gives you a nice sense of depth and parallax, which is really cool to see. And it helps it read as high poly too, which is the main goal of this. Just passing over this whole thing, picking some areas that hadn't been integrated yet, and getting them all connected together. This part here, this like cylindrical extrusion, this was something I mentioned in the high poly video that I kind of wish I had noticed when I was doing the blockout, and I just kind of didn't. So I didn't integrate it as well as I could have. And what I meant by that was if I had noticed this really when I was working on the blockout, I could have built it in such a way that all these edges lined up together. So that when we had to connect them, or I could have even connected it on the blockout actually, but basically so that when we connected them, we wouldn't have to do this manual work here of deleting some edges from the cylinder and making sure everything lines up and then bridging it all. We could have just made sure in the first place that all the edges lined up, and then we would just have to bridge, or we could just merge it in the actual blockout. And then when we forked it to the high poly, we could just make supporting edges around it, and when we forked it here to the low poly, we could just delete construction geometry. And that would have been ideal because there was a little duplicated work there. that I had to do in both the high poly, and then later on I had to do again in the low poly. But that's kind of cool. Like that's just something I noticed like watching these videos over again. So something to keep in mind in future. And sometimes you do just miss stuff when you're working on like a concept gun that you can't necessarily go find reference for. You just have the concept, and sometimes you'll miss little details on it. And of course, this is a job where it pays to be like detail minded and notice as much of that as possible. But sometimes stuff just gets by you. Like I was working on this SMG once. It was like a personal project, and it was really funny because I had built like the whole thing and I had gotten it through baking and I was about to start texturing, and then someone pointed out to me, I think it was in a class actually. It was back when I was in college, and someone pointed out to me that it would be cool if, or that they basically, I had read off the concept. It was like a 2D side orthographic, and I had read part of it as being an extended stock, and I had modeled it to be like an extended stock, right? And it's this tiny little compact SMG. And then I was kind of like somebody asked me like, "Hey, where's the magazine on this?" And I was like, "I don't know. I didn't even really model one because it was a case where like the grip is where I would normally have assumed the magazine went in like a design that looked like this one. It's like a pistol, right? Like you feed the magazine through the pistol grip. But in this case, the grip was really curved, so a magazine wouldn't have worked. So basically, I just I just said like screw it, and I just made the overall shape of the gun, and I didn't really make a magazine. And I was just totally mystified, like how this concept art is meant for this thing to feed, right? And I was just thinking like, oh man, like the concept is cool shapes, but the guy just wasn't thinking functionally. Like, oh, he must not even know how guns work. And then this guy in class pointed out to me that what I thought was supposed to be an extending stock was actually just a really cool like magazine feed system, where you kind of fed the magazine in horizontally through the back of the weapon. And that's like really, I don't know if that would work or not, but it's kind of like a cool visual idea, right? And I just completely missed it. So that's one of the funniest things I've missed on a concept. I think luckily that wasn't for like paid work or something. Um, yeah, that was pretty funny, man. But yeah, I mean, you gotta be observant to notice these things. You gotta, the more you know about your subject, like if you make a lot of guns or whatever, then the more you know about that stuff, the easier it gets to read this concept work. And if you're a concept artist watching this or whatever, or if you kind of make concepts on your own, then it can really help if you have like an unusual mechanism on your gun, like a like a weird way the magazine feeds or something. It can be really nice to anyone who decides to like model your stuff if you actually like draw a little call out image. Like in that case, if the guy had just drawn like even a basic sketch showing that that piece was in fact a magazine and like how it went in, and maybe even how the chamber worked if there was any possible way it could have. Just a tiny little sketch of that would have helped so much in making that because it wouldn't have been up to me to either notice it or not, from like the side orthographic thing. So a little bit of fault going both ways there. Yeah, I still think that was funny. So yeah, so while I was telling that story, we pretty much just connected all these little insets and holes and created all this geometry. This is something else where I had to actually duplicate work because I did a lot of this stuff on the high poly as well. So this is something where I might have benefited from once I had gotten these holes in on the blockout before moving on. Maybe I should have duplicated the blockout off to the side and hid it so that I still had a copy of the pro boolean saved. But then with the main geometry in the blockout, collapsed the boolean to an editable poly, and then done some of this connection work there. Because then I wouldn't have had to do it on both the high poly and low poly, right? Because the blockout geometry that I took to both of those would have had it built in. So that's another good little tip to myself that I should have done here. Most of this went pretty smoothly though. And then back here, there's some bits like we could turn all of this stock, including the cheek rest and these buttons. We could turn it all into one mesh actually, and it would make for a slightly faster bake because we wouldn't have to explode parts off. The reason I'm not doing it is because sometimes it can be nice to have things as actual separate meshes in certain cases. Like basically, like if you connect things like this together, you're going to be relying on the normal map for the seam between them. And that can work fine on something like the receiver where we know we're going to be giving a lot of map space to it. So we know it'll carry a thin detail like a panel line or like a gap between objects. But this stock, we might or might not end up giving it a lot of map space, right? Like it'll certainly be on its own texture because we know the stock is one of the parts we want to be able to swap out later because all three variants of this concept have very different stocks. And we've built the gun in such a way that it will be easy to swap them out. So we know that the stocks will be on their own UVs, and that might be like a good candidate for the first thing you want to size down if performance becomes an issue in the game or something. And especially since it's like behind first-person view, it's something you don't really have to put a lot of texture detail in, just into the parts, that you can actually still see a sliver of first person, which is not much of it. It's just the front of the cheek rest. So because we don't know how exactly high res the stock will be, it's not always wisest to allow your normal map to carry fine details like that. So right there, we're just going to leave that the cheek rest separate on the stock and the button separate. And then the actual geometry of those pieces can handle the, conveying that they're separate pieces of geometry. And some final pass stuff here, just connecting this top rail to the top of the receiver. We're doing that now at this late stage because we've finally connected the heat shield to the upper receiver, so we have the full length here that we can attach the rail to, because the rail runs down the entire length of the gun. I learned recently, I think this kind of configuration is actually, it's got a funny name. It's called like a monolithic upper, as in like a monolith, like in 2001. It's kind of funny, like first time I heard it, I thought the guy was just being like artful with his language, but I guess it's an actual gun term in early.
And the upper receiver are the same piece instead of being connected. But that might just be an AR-15 term or not. But it's a really funny one, in my opinion. So I'll probably end up using them for tons of stuff. I'll do to check if, because we're doing a lot of like tight welding work here, and sometimes we miss little parts, like little vertices on different objects that weren't close enough together to get picked up by welds. If you go to border select mode in 3ds Max and you just select your whole model, it'll of course like highlight any open edge borders, and that's useful because you'll immediately see if you have any edges floating around that are not connected where they should be, because you'll just get like a little red edge or a series of edges right in the middle of your model where there isn't like a symmetry line or otherwise a reason for there to be a border. And then you can just focus on those areas and look at the geometry of them and figure out how to connect them up. Connecting the side rail. You can see on both of these rails that I end up connecting on, just to make them work better with the geometry of the pieces they're connecting to. We add a few edges that are technically redundant to them. So these, I think, 4 edges that we just ran along this side rail, you can see they're obviously not adding anything to the silhouette. So you could say like, yeah, technically they're wasteful. In reality, not terribly, because it helps us connect these pieces to the main pieces without getting a lot of really long, thin triangles on the connecting pieces. And that's good because that can cause some problems of its own later on with display or with baking. It also, when we have a few edges like that, it'll make sure we don't get as much distortion when we do our bakes. And that can be helpful in rails because if you have floating rail teeth like we do, you can just move those teeth off somewhere else to explode them elsewhere, but then you still bake all the teeth to the flat plane of the rail. So then maybe on LODs you can just delete all the floating rail teeth, and because your normal map and your AO and whatever still have the teeth kind of baked in a flat way, then even if they get dropped out of geometry as the gun LODs,
you'll still have like an image of the rails there, which is kind of cool. Just some final path stuff goings over, just collapsing a few edges that I noticed that we didn't need, just to slightly save on try count. This thing ends up at about 12,000, which is nothing we couldn't bring down, but it's also not too excessive. Just looking at a lot of games that are released nowadays, looking at their guns, and knowing that we're coming into like a new console cycle and everything, 12,000 is really not a huge deal these days, especially not for a rifle. So I'm not going to sweat it too much. There's definitely some stuff we could reduce, so I might do that later on before we UV. But there's also some areas I might actually round out a bit before we UV too, so I don't know. But that's most of the low poly right there, so I hope you guys liked this video. I know it was a lot of welding, a few little tangent stories on my part, but I'm just trying to make it interesting. So in the next video, we're going to be doing a little cleanup to the high poly and low poly, and we're going to be doing the unwrap. So thanks for watching.